Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's talk is entitled Beyond Traditional Endpoints, a patient-focused approach to enhancing rare disease trials. My name is Kelsey Brown, and I am the Director of Medical Writing Solutions at TransPerfect Life Sciences based in London, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator for today's session. Today's session will run for approximately 60 minutes, and then we'll also have some Q&A at the end with our speakers as well. This event is proudly hosted by One2Treat. One2Treat is a forward-thinking partner for biopharmaceutical companies dedicated to delivering transformative insights in clinical trial design, analysis, and market access evaluations to support holistic treatment decisions. One2Treat was founded in July 2023 after 4 years of advanced research and software development incubation within IDDI Group. Driven by a commitment to patient centricity, One2Treat leverages modern statistical methodologies and advanced software solutions, ushering in a new era of personalized healthcare. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to today's speakers. We have Dr. Pascal Piedbois, Chief Medical Officer of One2Treat. Pascal is a professor of medical oncology with broad experience from both the academic and industry sectors. Within the industry, Pascal has held several leadership roles, including Vice President, Head of Global Oncology and Infectious Disease at AstraZeneca, and Senior Vice President, Head of Medical at Bristol Myers Squibb. Pascal's passion and commitment to combining digital innovation with medical relevance is set to enable the incorporation of patient preferences and needs into the development of market access of new treatments. And then we also have Dr. Sébastien Coppe, Chief Executive Officer of One2Treat. Sébastien brings extensive expertise in the field of clinical trials and artificial intelligence, and he did his PhD in neurosciences, working closely with patients and developing neural network models to diagnose rare kinds of dementia. Sébastien is driven by a strong conviction in the potential of innovative digital solutions to meet the overall patient's needs and accelerate clinical research timelines. And with that, I will pass the presentation to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. So our objective of today's webinar is to kind of elevate the discussion around clinical trial endpoints by exploring how a more patient-focused and holistic approach can enhance the way rare disease clinical trials are run today. And we believe that basically there are two main benefits from this new approach. One, it better reflects what matters most to patients. And second, it requires a smaller number of participants. And we know how critical this idea about sample size is when you speak about rare disease clinical trials. So let's start maybe with a step back, and a step back to understand kind of at its core, a clinical trial aims to demonstrate that one new treatment, here in blue, for instance, is better than another one. Let's call it the standard treatment, so the standard of care, control, as you want to. But how do we define the better? How do we define that one treatment is better than the other one? So that's really where the primary endpoint comes into the game. And the primary endpoint, it's a pre-specified measures that helps determine later on the trial success or not. And so that's really what we are going to speak about today. So as you probably know, the vast majority of clinical trials that are running today only focuses on one single outcome. So in other words, one single primary endpoint in order to assess the clinical trial success and whether or not ultimately a new treatment may deserve to get to market or not. Of course, if you step back and you ask patients, and especially patients suffering from a rare disease, those patients will probably tell you that there are multiple outcomes, multiple facets of their disease that are really important, that they do care about. And this idea about having a single outcome basically reflecting what's important for them is not really accurate. So those patients will probably suggest to again, look at multiple dimensions, multiple facets of their kind of day-to-day life, and define what is good for them as a new treatment in a slightly more holistic, comprehensive way. So why not changing the paradigm and better leveraging the vast amount of collected data in clinical trials in order to assess treatment effects with a more multi-dimensional way, more holistic way? That's exactly the idea that Mark Boyce, One2Treat founder, had about 15 years ago. And the idea is really kind of fairly simple. Is let's try to incorporate multiple outcomes within a single treatment assessment. And if we do so, this single treatment assessment may become the primary endpoint of the clinical trial and may become the pre-specified definition of why do you believe that a new treatment is better than another one for a specific condition. So that's really the idea. And of course, Mark Boyce is a really famous biostatistician. He's also the founder of IDDI company, the founder of CluePoints company, different kind of companies with a deep expertise in biostatistics. And the idea that Mark, let's say, mentioned was building what we call the net treatment benefits. This will be something that we'll speak a lot about today. Net treatment benefits will be explained in a minute by Pascal. Just a few information before I'm moving towards this kind of definition of the concept of the net treatment benefit. As I was mentioning, the first scientific publication, from Mark Boyce, was published in 2010, so already 15 years ago. And on the meantime, there have been more than 50 peer-reviewed scientific publications by different kind of academic groups. So this net treatment benefit method is really, from a scientific standpoint, really well accepted by the scientific community. And there's been also recently a handbook of what we call Generalized Pairwise Comparisons, which is more the name of the biostatistical methodology behind this concept of net treatment benefits. This book has been published this month by Mark Boyce and other really famous scientific people, biostatisticians. Last information, really important. This book, has been also prefaced by the FDA. Postface was coming from Francesco Pignati from EMA Oncology. So in other words, regulators are more and more also aware and approving this kind of methodology, and that's something that we'll come back to this later on. But as I was mentioning, this is at the very beginning of biostatistical methodology, but it has been meant with this idea about finding an application more in clinical trials and being so simple in terms of concepts to be understood that it may be fully understood and used, leveraged by both clinicians and patients or patient advocates. So why not trying to give it an explanation more focusing on the clinical concepts rather than biostatistical concepts? Pascal?
Sure. Thank you, Sébastien. So although this is really, let's say, a sophisticated methods, it's quite accessible for clinicians. And that is really one of the messages that we really want to share with you today. It is accessible for clinicians, and I would even say more. This is something that clinicians can use and not only understand. So to make it simple, but we also have a video on One2Treat website that you can see whenever you want. So to make it simple, we are here talking about randomized clinical trials, and this is really important. This is only in the context of randomized clinical trial. So we are basically comparing a new treatment versus a control arm. And if you go to the next slide or the next click, what we do basically in these methods is we do a pairwise patient comparison. What does that mean? It means that if you have, let's say, 10 patients in treatment in the experimental arm and 10 patients in the standard arm, you will have 10 by 10, 10 times 10, meaning 100 pairs of patients that you will examined. And in fact, each patient in one treatment arm is compared to each patient in the other arm. So we take all pairs, so 10 and 10, it means in the case I took, it means 100 pairs of patients, and we do the examination of each of these pairs. And basically what we do is we say whether or not the experimental arm is better or worse than the control arm. So let's take this example, but as you will see, we will really focus on rare disease, and we will give later on a very concrete example of rare disease. But to make it simple, if you want to take into consideration not only one outcome, but in the case in hand on this slide, 3 outcomes, like how fast does the treatment work? So works faster. How about the complications or the safety, and how about the quality of life? You can very well do that using the net treatment benefit method. What you do is you compare patients for each of the pairs of patients, and you simply say whether or not one patient is doing better than the other one. And as we will see, you do that progressively, and I would say successively, for each of the outcomes that you have taken into consideration. If you go to the next slide, so this is basically what you do, and it means that progressively, I would say outcome by outcome, you will be able to say whether or not the experimental arm is better than the control arm. If you go to the next slide, Sébastien. In terms of stats, again, I mean, this is easily understandable for clinicians. What you do at the end of the day is you, for each treatment arm, you sum all pairwise scores. So you give a score for each of the comparison, and you divide by the total number of patients pairs. So in terms of, simply said, the net treatment benefit is the net probability that the random patient in the new treatment group or new treatment arm has a better outcome than a random patient in the control arm. These will become even more clear when we give an example. So if you go to the next slide, yes, I think I will pass on to you, Sébastien.
Yes, thank you, Pascal. So this was the kind of basic concepts of what the net treatment benefit may allow us to do. And again, as Pascal was mentioning, we'll use in a minute a simple case study coming from a rare disease clinical trial. So you will probably better understand how those multiple outcomes may come into the game and how to assess the net treatment benefit. What is really important to be kept in mind is that One2Treat has been developing over the past years some software solutions for both pharma and academic sponsors to support the engagement of clinicians and patients advocates to identify and prioritize the most relevant outcomes, the most clinically relevant outcomes, leading to a composite primary endpoint with these kind of prioritized outcomes. We'll come back to this in a minute with this example. But if you just try to step back right now, and why do we believe that software solutions can help? We do believe that there are multiple benefits of this approach, multiple advantages. On top of better reflecting what is really what matters most to patients, we may also better leverage the collected data points. Typically, that may lead also to a really significant sample size reduction. We'll show you an example, but typically you may expect about 20–30% sample size reduction, less patients in your rare disease clinical trials, which is really something important in those kind of rare disease clinical trial design. And of course, I mean, in terms of reducing the timelines, that's similar. You can expect if you reduce by 30% the sample size, you can expect to reduce by more than 30% the time it takes to recruit your patients. And it's, of course, allowing us, I mean, to expect having a faster, I would say, time to market, smaller budget for the trial. So that's really, really very, very important. And again, we'll come back right now in this example about how can we, with those kind of software solutions, in a very fairly easy way, engage with either patient advocates or clinicians, being, for instance, key opinion leaders, being site investigators, and in order to make sure that they do define, or they do help, let's say, the pharma or the academic sponsor define the primary endpoint. That's exactly the business case right now that Pascal will speak about, a business case coming from rare disease clinical trial, Sjögren syndrome.
Thank you, Sébastien. So yeah, I mean, we have chosen these rare disease, and for let's say a simple reason, which is although it's a rare disease, this is a disease well known, I would say, by every physician. This is something that we learn at medical school, and it's rare, but it's not exceptional. So you must be, whatever your expertise is, you must be somewhat familiar with this Sjögren syndrome, that sometimes we also call Gaucher-Sjögren syndrome. So what it is basically, it is an autoimmune disease, and it is an autoimmune disease in which the glands that produce fluid, like, for example, tears or saliva or any kind of fluids that the body produces, doesn't work properly. So it stopped working properly. There are multiple common symptoms, and those symptoms include dry eyes, dry mouth, aching muscles and joints, tiredness, skin dry, all, and again, I think this is something that is easily understandable, because as soon as you have this kind of fluid disorder, as you can imagine, you do have this kind of consequences on multiple organs. And in fact, although it's not that exceptional, there is no currently an existing definitive cure of these Sjögren syndrome, but there are existing treatments that can help managing symptoms. If you go to the next slide, Sébastien. Yeah, so this is typically an example in which it's not that easy when you want to design a new trial. It's not that easy to really choose what is the most relevant endpoints. And of course, if you take into consideration all these, symptoms that the patient can suffer from, you immediately, imagine that, what you want to measure is, in fact, a broad scope of outcomes. So, in fact, when you look at the literature, you see those, and it's not an exhaustive list of, endpoints already used in clinical trials. You have multiple outcomes used in clinical trials. Some of them are most frequently used, and we will get back to that, but some of them are not used in every study. And again, this is typically an example in which it's difficult to choose what is the best only outcome that you would like to measure, and B, if you do that, you would probably not be able to take into consideration everything that matters, I would say, for the patient. If you go to the next slide, so what we have, what we have decided to do in this patient-centered approach is we want to be able to capture patient and clinicians' preferences, because of course, based on the previous slide, you can easily imagine that the preferences of patients is really, really important. Anything we do, we need to make sure that we are able to really address the patient needs. And so the patients, I would say, even expectations in terms of outcomes. So we want also to be able to make sure that we, at the end of the day, come up with what is best for the patients and have an holistic treatment assessment. And that is the challenge that we want to address with this net treatment benefit. If you go to the next slide, Sébastien. So that, I will pass on to you for this one.
Thanks, Pascal. So yeah, that's the reason why we wanted to design a very super simple application that we call One2Treat Voice application. And this really super simple application is meant to be used by either clinicians or patients advocates typically. And so clinicians may be site investigators, maybe key opinion leaders. And the idea again is to help the sponsor of the clinical trial to define the list of the most important, the most clinically relevant outcomes. And again, not to do it with just the sponsor being involved, but also involve those kind of patient community, involve differently those kind of clinicians that may have a lot of expertise in this specific disease and may be able, to, I would say, answer simple questions. And simple questions would be, basically, you would choose a few of those outcomes. Imagine here in this really super simple example, we would have chosen, 3 outcomes, a kind of an index more meant for clinicians, and another index for patient-reported outcomes, and another one that is more focusing on fatigue. Again, you may understand that you may take pain into consideration, quality of life, and all the other outcomes that Pascal has been speaking about. You may have more than 3, but what we want is leveraging some kind of artificial intelligence techniques. Being able, to display some kind of different relevant values for 2 different patients. You see here patient number 7 on the left and patient number 12 on the right. Okay, so those are virtual kind of patients. What we would ask either the patient advocate or the clinicians using this simple app to do is basically to click on the button like, do I believe that the left patient outcomes are better, or do I believe that the right patient's outcome are better? And basically, I will just see different kind of pairs of patients, and I will have to choose which patient seems to have the best outcome. And by doing that, I will define the best, the better treatment. What is best, for patients? And this will allow me within typically 20-25 minutes as a patient advocate, or me as a clinician, to really express my thought process about which would be the ideal level or sequence of prioritized outcomes, also related to associated with something that we call a threshold of clinical similarity or clinical relevance. What does it mean? It means that at some point of time, you may have the feeling that 2 patients would have similar outcomes, even if, for instance, in terms of fatigue, it's a bit better, but in terms of pain, for instance, it's a bit worse. You see, and basically it's balancing each other, meaning that a small difference in fatigue or a small difference in pain is not clinically relevant to make a call on which treatment is better than the other. So that's really the idea about the threshold of clinical relevance. Again, that would be extracted by an AI algorithm from this really super simple app. So that's really the idea. And again, why did we design this? The why was really what we want to do is helping the trial sponsors defining this list of prioritized outcome, being able to share this list of prioritized outcome with the regulators, but also not just the list of prioritized outcome, but also sharing with regulators all the data that's led to this decision. And data leading to this decision is we were involving, this patient community or site investigators, and this is basically the consensus. The list of prioritized outcome is the consensus of what those patients advocates or clinicians did answer when using the One2Treat Voice app. Let's maybe take a simple example to make sure this is making sense for you. Pascal, do you want to illustrate this with this Sjögren syndrome example?
Sure. So let's say you have done these prioritization. Of course, these list of prioritized outcome is debatable. And I'm not an expert in Sjögren syndrome, but I'm sure that some experts would argue that these may not be the ones they would have chosen. But let's say you have gone through these prioritization exercise with, let's say, a panel of experts or whatever, and you end up with these list of prioritized outcomes that we will use in the rest of the presentation. And you have basically 4 outcomes that you want to take into consideration. One is the SDI, which is a clinical assessment taking into consideration several symptoms. And then you have exactly what Sébastien described. You also have a kind of threshold, and you say, okay, I want the difference between the 2 patients that I will compare in the pair of patients. I want this difference to be at least 3 points to be considered as clinically meaningful. And that is really important for the rest of the discussion, because of course, you may say that, if you have a very small difference, and I took SDI as an example, but you can take any of these at least 3 first outcomes. You may very well say, I mean, if I have a very, very small difference between, the experimental patient and the control patient in my pair of patients, these will not be clinically relevant. And then I may not consider that, there is a better patient compared to in one group compared to the other one. One thing I would like to insist on this slide is you can, in fact, include into the model anything you wish to have in terms of variables. You can have binary variables, you can have continuous variable, you can have biomarkers, you can have everything that you consider, or the panel of experts or patients would consider as clinically relevant. And of course, you would agree with the health authorities when you design your clinical trials. If you go to the next slide, please, Sébastien. So again, these net treatment benefit is defined by patient advocates or clinicians. We do think that it better reflects what matters most for the patients. It aligns also with clinical objectives and patient needs. We do think that it leverages more of the collected data, and we will see that because, using a, let's say, traditional approach, as we will see in a minute, some of these let's say, information are not completely taken into consideration, whereas the net treatment benefit really take advantage of every information you get from the trial. And finally, but that is really a very important consideration, especially in the space of rare disease. In most of the instances, these methods also allows a reduction of the sample size, and we will describe more in a minute. If you go to
that's for the trial design. So that's what you can expect from, in terms of advantages, in terms of trial design. But maybe, imagine that right now the clinical trial has been designed using this list of 4 different kind of prioritized outcomes for this Sjögren syndrome. And maybe what would be interesting, Pascal, is you explain a bit more what you can expect at the end of the clinical trial in terms of analysis. How would you analyze the data at the end of the clinical trial? And would it be kind of still really easy for patients, for clinicians to understand the results, the outcome of such a clinical trial, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take an example, and let's enter a little bit into the engine and into what we do to really calculate a net treatment benefit. So we proceed step by step, and as already described, you have a prioritized outcomes, you have a list of prioritized outcomes, and you have an order of a ranking, if you wish, of these prioritized outcome. And in the case in hand, you start with these SD outcome, and what we do is we take, as said, we take each pair of patients and we simply say, okay, for this pair of patients, is the patient treated in the experimental arm doing better or worse than the patient treated in the control arm? And you do that for each of the pairs of patients. So all pairs of patients are taken into consideration at the first step. And in the case in hand, but it's again, it's a simulated case, of course, but it's in the case in hand, you have 34% of the pairs in favor of the experimental arm, compare with 22% of the pairs in favor of the control arms. What does that mean? It means that, for some of those pairs, 44% in the case in hand, you don't really have what we call a clinically meaningful difference between the two. And if you stopped here, and Sébastien will come to back to these because this is really important. So if you had, for example, considered only one outcome, which would have been, the SD, you would basically stop here, and the 44% of neutral pairs, what we call neutral pairs, wouldn't tell you so much, and that would be a kind of lost information to some extent. Whereas in the net treatment benefit method, you make those pairs speak to some extent, and you use these 44% pairs of patients for the next step, which is the ESPRIT analysis. And in this one, you do exactly the same. You take each of the remaining pairs of patients, so each of these remaining 44% of pairs of patients, and you simply compare each of the pairs of patients between experimental and control. In the case in hand, 12% of the pairs were in favor of experimental arm, whereas 6% are in favor of the control arm. And you have 26% of the pairs which are neutral. One thing I would like to draw your attention to is at each step, you can very well do a net treatment benefit estimate, which, at the first step was 12%, simply given by 34% minus 22%. And you do exactly the same as the second step, which is, 12% versus 6%. And I'm insisting on this one because the methods is not, if you wish, is not a black box, meaning that you can very well say what is the contribution of each of these outcomes. So you know what is the contribution of SD, you know what is the contribution of ESPRIT, and you have understood me, meaning that, the third step, you would take into consideration the fatigue, and at the last, and exactly doing the same exercise, and at the last step, you will take into consideration the adverse events grade 3, 4, which may not be in favor of the experimental arm, and which I would even say often are not in favor of the experimental arm. So that can be also to some extent detrimental. It's not really important because, again, there is no hidden step, there is no black box, and you simply do the net treatment benefit at each step, and you simply, if I may say, you simply do the sum of net treatment benefit and come up with an overall net treatment benefit, which in the case in hand is 24%. Now, I'm going to stop here, or I'm going to pause here, because I would like to ask Sébastien, what really does this mean in terms of, advantage, let's say for sample size, or let's say in terms of, understanding really the benefit of the experimental arm compared to the control arm. So can you comment on this one?
Yeah, and that's a great point, because as I was mentioning, we know that in rare disease clinical trial, it's always hard to recruit patients, to find those patients. And of course, the smaller the sample size, the more likely that your clinical trial will go to the end and will recruit, faster and so on. So that's really something very important. Is, do we believe that we have here reason to think that we'll be able to reduce the sample size? And the answer is most likely yes. Why? As you were already mentioning it, Pascal, here, if we just stop to the first outcome, let's imagine that in a standard clinical trial, you would have a standard design with a single outcome for the primary endpoint. Then basically you would compare, probably not pairwise comparison, you would focus on the two groups, experimental treatment, control treatment, and trying to understand whether there is a significant treatment effect. But to some aspect, all the patients that would have the same kind of values for this kind of SDA index score, basically those kind of patients would balance each other, meaning that you can probably imagine that more or less 44% of the total amount of information here would not allow you to draw a conclusion, would not allow you to differentiate or distinguish the two treatments. And of course, it's a bit sad because, as you were just mentioning, Pascal, this is kind of lost data. Maybe, you can also use this in many different clinical trials, for instance, about rare tumors in oncology, where you have patients that are still alive at the end of the clinical trial, and if, of course, it was the primary endpoint was about overall survival, you kind of forget those patients as well, exactly for the same reason, because you cannot distinguish based on the primary endpoint, that would be OS. So that's where we believe that it's not always fair for the patients, it's not always smart in terms of using the data, leveraging the data. And that's really the idea about the net treatment benefit. Is really, let's make sure that the 44% of the pairwise comparisons here, where you're not able to distinguish on the first outcome, you make the data speak, and you ask those kind of pairs of patients, like, do you believe that there is something else that may tell the patient whether a treatment is better than the other one? If you focus on the the next step, bringing an extra 6% of net treatment benefit, you understood that basically the cumulative net treatment benefit would be moving from 12% to 18%, and as Pascal nicely explained, this is a cumulative kind of conclusion. But if right now we look to the required sample size, you will see that it's really closely associated or correlated with this kind of cumulative net treatment benefit. But here, imagine that again, we were having a design of a clinical trial based on the expected treatment effect on this first outcome. It may lead to basically 185 patients to be recruited. That's the sample size of the clinical trial based on one single outcome. If you right now select a second outcome, you understand that you may expect a larger net treatment benefit. Why? Because you've been leveraging more of the data, more of the information part of the clinical trial. If you do it again and again and again, you understand that the cumulative net treatment benefit will move from 12 to 18, 23, and at the end of the day, 24%. I insist on that, that's really important. You can quite quickly understand where is the 24% coming from. It's the sum of 12% benefit coming from the first outcome, this index is coming from 6% coming from the second outcome, the second index score, more patient-reported outcomes. 5% of the total net treatment benefit is coming from the fatigue. So that's really transparent and easy to be understood by both clinicians and patients. And this leads, at the end of the day, by to 24% net treatment benefit. You see here that basically you were able to double the net treatment benefit, moving from one single outcome to 4 different prioritized outcomes using the net treatment benefit. What does it mean? It means that if you right now do not only consider a single outcome, standard kind of design that would have required 185 patients, but you use the net treatment benefits on those kind of 4 prioritized outcomes that have been selected or defined by either patient advocates and or clinicians, you can expect not only to better reflect what is important for patients, not only to better leverage the data collected in clinical trials, but also at the design stage, you may also definitely run your simulations and realize that actually you do not need 185 patients, you need only 122. Here it's an example. but that's typically kind of the range, the order of magnitudes that we've been observing in different clinical trial design over the last few months, having between 20 to 50% sample size reduction. Depends on the trial, depends on the therapeutic areas, depends of course on your treatment effects that are expected, but you may expect, I mean, those kind of very significant sample size reduction coming from the fact that you better leverage the information that is present, that is collected during your clinical trial. I hope it was clear, and I guess it's probably time to right now conclude, Pascal, and summarize what we've been discussing today, which is about being able to better leverage the data and de-risking the trial, reducing the sample size, but also, as I was mentioning, bringing this kind of transparent view on what's the individual contribution of each outcome. So that's more about what you can expect during the end of the clinical trial, but maybe let's step back and Pascal, maybe conclude on that slide.
Yeah, thank you, Sébastien. Well, in fact, if you think about it, and we mostly focus today on clinical trial design, but if you think about it, of course, I mean, the life of a new brand doesn't start with the trial design. In fact, it starts with the preclinical, it starts with the early phases, and it doesn't stop with the trial design. In fact, the life of a new brand continue I mean, to HTA and commercialization, of course. We do think that using these net treatment benefit methods, you have multiple advantages compared to the let's say more standard approach. The first one is you engage more, and I would even say better, with patient advocates and clinicians. In my life with drug companies, but also in my life with academic collaborative groups, I've been so many times frustrated not being able to really have tangible impact of patients into the clinical trial design. This is really a tangible way to make sure that we hear the voice of the patients. So that's, to me, I would say, number one advantage of the methods. B, you are, of course, due to these better engagement, you have more, let's say, patient centricity. I mean, not only you speak and you think in terms of patient centricity, but you act in terms of patient centricity. I do think that taking into consideration multiple outcomes and not only a single one, you have multifacets, you have multi-dimensional assessment of the relevance of your new drug, and so you increase the clinical relevance of the trial. As said by Sébastien, and it's not a small advantage, you often have a decrease in sample size, and I think this is particularly true and particularly important in the rare diseases. You decrease the clinical timelines. Why? Because you decrease the sample size, of course, but not only that, because you have a better engagement with investigators who take part into the design actively. And so my expectation is that they will be more engaged, and at the end of the day, the accrual will be speed up. Importantly, for everyone, I would say first for the drug pharmas, but also for the patients. And I had yesterday a discussion with patient advocacy groups, and they said, well, we want to make sure that we have access to new drugs in good conditions, and we want to make sure that we are not, let's say, eliminating drugs which in fact work. And if the assessment would have been based on a single endpoint, maybe we would have been able to demonstrate. So you de-risk your development, which is critically important. And finally, you increase the quality of the clinician information when it comes to, you know, the commercialization of the drug. Why? Because as a clinician myself, I've been so many times, let's say, confused by situations in which you had, you know, some of the what we call secondary outcomes or secondary endpoints in favor of the treatment, but some others are not in favor of the treatment. So I got really confused, and it's really not easy for me to make my decision, to have a clear mind, and at the end of the day to make my decision when it comes to, you know, treating a patient. So I mean, using multiple outcomes assessment, you do have the as a clinician, you do have the possibility, the ability, I would even say, to have a more informed clinical discussion. As you can imagine, this is also informing better HTAs. And so often I've been, you know, in situations talking with HTS buddies, in situation in which, you know, that was not that easy to demonstrate a clear, let's say, risk-benefit advantage of a new drug, just because, you know, it was not possible to have a quantitative, and I'm gonna insist on the word quantitative assessment of the new drug. So I'm gonna pause here, and maybe you want to say a few words of conclusion, Sébastien.
No, I hope it helped understand, I mean, how this kind of new innovative approach, but I insist on that, an approach that is there for 15 years, that's been really widely used, really, really popular in cardiovascular disease clinical trials, for instance, not having only been able, I mean, to have a lot of clinical trials being designed in cardiovascular, but also 2 drugs being approved by regulators at the end of this process. So I do believe this net treatment benefits methodology is a methodology that would definitely benefit highly and bring a lot of advantages to rare disease clinical trials. And we have seen probably a few clinical trials in rare disease benefiting from it in terms of trial design over the past years, not enough compared to other therapeutic areas. And again, I mean, let's make sure we can be aware about that, discuss about that, and do not be afraid about regulators, because as mentioned before, they're really, really, I would say, supporting this innovative methodology that not only better reflect what matters to patients, but also allows to reduce sample size in rare disease trials. It's so much important. That's definitely part of multiple guidance from FDA and so on. So we are really happy to further discuss it with you guys. So thank you for your attention. And I guess it's back to you, Kelsey.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was amazing. Thank you for the detailed presentation. And I hope our audience enjoyed this as well. So yeah, we'll jump into some Q&A to wrap up the session. I'll go through a few questions that have been pre-submitted. And then Sébastien and Pascal, if you want to jump in and share your insights, that would be great. So I'll start with the first question we received. So how long does it typically take for a patient advocate or site investigator to use the One2Treat Voice app to express their treatment preferences?
I can, if you wish, Sébastien, I can easily take the question, and I say easily because I did these. I went through these yesterday, not later than yesterday, and my message is it's not a limiting factor. Timing is not a limiting factor. I mean, to do these, you know, prioritization exercise for a group of users, it takes 15-20 minutes. So it's not a limiting factor. What is more tricky, I would say, but that is our work, is really to make sure that we have everything in place, meaning that, you know, the software that really help to make this prioritization is finalized, well in place, and so on and so on. So that is, let's say, the beyond the scene exercise. This is ours. This is One2Treat's. But for the users, it takes 15-20 minutes. It's not a limiting factor. Thanks.
When you're speaking about the software being ready, I believe what you meant is also making sure that the level of communication is adapted to the audience. I believe you were referring yesterday to this survey you did with the One2Treat Voice solution, with patient advocates and making sure that patient advocates understand easily all the outcomes that are, I would say, defined there. And so I guess that's the point of making sure we're to work hand in hand with the sponsor of the trial in order to make sure, the communication is relevant for the audience, right?
Correct.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll move on to our next question then. So what level of sample size reduction can be expected when applying this approach?
So that's a good and a bit tricky question, because there is no kind of single answer. It obviously depends on the clinical trial design, on the indication, on the expected treatment effects. What is really important to be kept in mind is that, as Pascal was mentioning, imagine you would prioritize 5 or 6 outcomes. You do not need to have all the outcomes moving in favor of your new treatment. You may definitely bring transparency on the fact that for some of those outcomes, I mean, there is no big negative effect, but there is kind of clearly no positive effect. You may have a -1 or -2% individual contribution of one outcome and that's okay. What you care about is, at the end of the day, what's the total cumulated net treatment benefit based on this kind of predefined list of prioritized outcomes. That's the most important. If you do so, what we've seen, I mean, over the past few months in rare disease clinical trial is you can expect to have significant amount of sample size reduction. I was giving, I believe, earlier today, an order of magnitude like between 20 to 50% sample size reduction. We've seen even more extreme examples, more than 50% sample size reduction, but that's probably more rare. But if I have to I would say, put a number on the table to just manage expectations, I would say 25–30% sample size reduction, maybe a good expectations, but do not be disappointed if for your trial design we only bring 15 or 20% sample size reduction. I guess it's definitely coming back to what's the percentage of the amount of information that you would not leverage, that you would not take into consideration when focusing on the primary endpoint, meaning all those kind of patients in different groups that are similar to each other. They will to some extent balance each other with a single outcome, single analysis, and that's probably where we made the data speak. And again, that's very positive for patients, because that's probably, if one patient, you give them in the first outcome and they are offered 2 treatments that are similar for this first outcome, I believe then this patient in a having a rare disease will probably ask questions about, yes, but what about this or this or this, another outcome, in order to make the call at the end of the day, which treatment is better for me. So in other words, the sample size reduction is really something that reflects the approach, the patient centricity approach, like, because it better reflects what matters to patients, then you can expect to better leverage the data, and then you can expect to have this kind of 20, 25, 30% sample size reduction.
Amazing, very helpful, thank you. I think that's all that we have time for today. So, we've reached the end of our Q&A. If you do have any questions at all, please reach out to info@iddi.com. That's info@iddi.com. And thank you, everyone, to our audience for participating in today's webinar. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator, and also just a final thank you to our speakers as well. Thank you for the amazing presentation. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Farewell.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, IDDI, for welcoming us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.